So Dr. Anand, I will turn on the recording.
Sure.
Yeah, so it says stop recording. It's already on record, I think.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think,
We have gone live, so I
sure.
think
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining in today for a scientific session, which will be on scientific writing and publication workshop. Firstly, I would like to thank the
Good
whole.
evening, everybody. Thank you for joining in today for a scientific session, which will be on scientific writing and publication workshop. Firstly, I would like to thank good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining in today for a
Latika,
scientific session.
the YouTube. I think there is an echo which is happening.
I turned it off. Now I think we can start.
Should okay? It should be okay. Yeah, I would like to thank Professor Vikas Agarwal and the whole team for agreeing to our request to have a workshop on scientific writing and publication. The reason why I wanted this is we as medical students or as postgraduates or as consultants were never taught this art, and we have learned it the hard way. Still, there are a lot of lacunae in our understanding about how to write it. There are a lot of things which we need to learn, and I thought this would be a very good platform to learn from people who are editors who scrutinize hundreds of articles every month. And I spoke to Latika and Professor Vikas Agarwal, and they thankfully agreed to come on board and have this workshop and meeting. I would like to introduce the faculty. Professor Vikas Agarwal is a professor of clinical immunology and rheumatology at SGPGI, Lucknow, and he is the current editor-in-chief of Indian Journal of Rheumatology. Dr. Vinod Ravindran is adjunct professor of medicine, KMC Manipal. He is the editor-in-chief of Journal of Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, past editor of IJR, and is a consultant rheumatologist at Center for Rheumatology in Kerala. Dr. Durga Prasad Mishra is Associate Editor of Rheumatology International and Indian Journal of Rheumatology, and Associate Clinical Editor of Journal of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. He is also an Assistant Professor, Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology, SGPGI. Dr. Ashish Goel is an Associate Professor of Department of Medicine, UCMS Delhi. He is also a visiting professor at University of Praspati, Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Dr. Latika Gupta is an associate editor, International Journal of Rheumatic Diseases. She's also a social media editor of Journal of Clinical Rheumatology and Indian Journal of Rheumatology. She is currently an assistant professor at Department of Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology at SGPGI. And Dr. Chengappa is a assistant professor, Department of Clinical Immunology at JIPMER Pondicherry, Puducherry now. So thank you so much for coming on and making this program. And I would like Dr. Latika to take the stage, please. Thank you so much. Latika, you're muted.
good evening, Dr. Rao, and thank you so much for the kind introductions. Professor Vikas Agarwal will now talk about why publish a scientific paper.
Very good evening, good afternoon, and maybe even good morning to all of you. And without wasting any time further, I'll straight away go to the topic, why write a scientific research paper? So we all know that what is science? In one word, we can define science as truth. But truth is not always obvious. One has to find ways and means to explore what is actually the truth. So we can define science as an ongoing process of discovery and identification of explanations of both existing as well as newer phenomena by doing some kind of experimentations or by doing some kind of observations. And when we share these findings of our experiment or observations, this is what we can call it as academic publication. So this is nothing but sharing of findings with scientific community. It enables our peers to benefit from our learning, to give them or stimulate them for newer ideas so that they can conduct their own new research, sometimes they give a very critical feedback on the paper, which actually helps the original researcher to have more questions and some more experiments to find out the actual truth and to improve the current knowledge base. But why is it really important to write a scientific paper? As far as this is concerned, I think one is to share one's work with the scientific community and to put the work, hard work done by a researcher in public domain, whereby this knowledge can be used by others for their own benefit or to conduct more research and to find out better questions and better answers. So once you create or share the knowledge and disseminate it amongst the peers, you provide stimulus for future research. And at places like where I am, this is a tertiary care teaching training research institute where scientific writing or research papers writing is important as part of teaching of our students and postdocs. So we have to take them on board when we are writing a paper, stimulate them to write a paper so that they could be better future researchers. Sometimes researches are done to address certain population specific problems whereby a community is benefited by that kind of knowledge. Also, there are practical benefits of writing a scientific paper. It enhances the prestige, it establishes the credentials of the person who is conducting the research, and it helps in getting the grants in future. And sometimes when you get a grant from the government agency, it is inherently incorporated part of the grant that you have to publish at least one or two or even more papers before you finally submit the final report of the grant. It also helps in the progression of the career of the researcher. And last but not the least, it is the passion or the curiosity to find out the truth, which actually leads to a researcher to write a scientific paper on his research. So, what are the benefits when you present your own work to the scientific community? It adds to the knowledge about the natural phenomena, and we being clinicians means more of a disease. It addresses gaps in the existing literature. There are so many gaps in the existing literature which needs to be filled up. And every day when we have more queries, we try to address them by conducting more and more research. And when we conduct research, obviously we get some questions and some answers. So that keeps on motivating for future research. Sometimes not only it is important for future research, but it also helps in generating the policies. Like in these times of COVID, any epidemiological study will help the bureaucrats in or the technocrats who are at the top level that they can generate policies for the communities. Also, when you share your work, you are providing information so that the other person need not repeat the same experiment. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. And when you find a new way to treat a disease, you are helping the whole of the humanity. And last but not the least, obviously it helps in providing a great satisfaction to the researcher when he or she has addressed a complicated query and has find out something which is applicable across the communities and the countries. So when you create and share the knowledge with the others, it not only helps in identifying the lacunae in the existing knowledge so that more queries can be generated and further researches can be done on so many questions which are arising out of it, but it provides help to the uh, community so that it enhances the understanding of the disease, and it may lead to implementation or finding of newer and the effective treatment of certain diseases. And when you share knowledge, also people who are far away from your place, they know about you and they may come across on board and collaborate. So it helps in fostering collaborations when somebody is publishing a research paper. Writing research papers as part of teaching is important for medical colleges and the teaching institutes, where we as a teacher not only has obligation to treat the patient, but also train the residents and also train them to conduct research, whereby the students learn to conduct a research and to express the findings of their research work in a research paper. And when they do this under the guidance of their teacher, they learn a lot. So it creates a generation of future researchers, and also they learn the art, science, and ethics of publication or publishing a research paper. In modern times, publishing a research paper not only entails the art and science, but more important than that, the ethical practices, which are generally not taught to us in the medical colleges. But when you mentor a student, then you can teach him or her what are the ethical standards of research publications, which we will be touching upon in some part in the coming part of the webinar, but as a part of continuation of our webinar series. Certain researches are conducted in a way to find out solutions for specific problems. Like we know that in different part of the country, there are different populations who have got different problems. Malaria is predominant a problem in the eastern coastal India, but not in regions like Uttar Pradesh or Lucknow, where we are. Similarly, diabetes is a more of an Indian problem as compared to the Western world, and same is true for the coronary artery disease, where the incidence and the prevalence of coronary artery disease is much more in Asians and with an earlier onset as compared to the Western world. The practical benefits of publishing a research paper is to enhance your prestige among the peers and the scientific community. People know about you and they appreciate your hard work and the quality of your research. It establishes your scholarly credentials. It helps you in getting grants in future, and also whatever grant you have obtained to conduct a particular research, it is some of the times it is the inherent component to publish papers, so that criteria is also fulfilled. In India, we have a system whereby if you publish, it helps in progression of your career. So especially in the government institutes, publications are required for promotion as part of your assessment promotion as far as guidelines by MCI, that is Medical Council of India, or the University Grants Commission norms are concerned. And many times when you apply for a job in a medical institute or a college, then you are better placed as compared to the other candidates when you have a good number of research papers in your name. So that kind of experience counts in your job selection also. There are various types of publications which I have listed here in form of original, review articles, case reports, editorials, letters to editor. These are the common formats, but there could be many more types of publications, which Latika is going to talk once I finish my presentation. So as far as this webinar is concerned, we will be discussing about the fundamentals of writing a scientific paper, including the structure of an original article. Every component of the original article will be discussed. Then we will be having an experience of actual reviewing a manuscript and identifying mistakes which one can avoid when somebody is writing a scientific paper. And in the next part of the series, we will be discussing about the ethical aspects of scientific publishing, pitfalls to avoid in scientific publishing, and how to identify predatory open access publishing so that your hard work does not go down the drain. So with this, I'll hand over the charge to Latika back so that she can present her work on what all kind of articles one can think of writing and publishing in scientific literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vikas. We will take a 2-minute break to disseminate the YouTube link, which seems to have changed, after which I'll resume with the next lecture. Good evening, everyone. Um, we will now be talking about the different types of research articles. And it is important to note this before we discuss how to write a manuscript. So this brings us to the question that when is an article considered scientific? Uh, you might like to think that the structure might lead to the name scientific. Yes, some articles do need to be in a particular structure, but we might challenge some notions here today and find that some articles are not that structured as we might like to believe. Peer review is an essential component of scientific article writing, and it validates the findings because accomplished peers review your article and they verify the details, and it is acceptable for publication only then. Apart from that, maybe articles are scientific when they talk about science, um, although it may not always be so, as we will see in a few minutes. So why do we need to understand what are the types of articles? Mainly because when you read an article, you allocate appropriate credence because some kinds of articles and research carry greater weightage than others. Also, if you as a scientist or as a clinician or researcher have some observations, you would like to validate them, and you need to use the optimal methods for successful publication. So by convention, there are primary, secondary, and tertiary kinds of scientific articles apart from gray literature. And then there are some special articles, which we will talk about today. So primary articles form the core group. These are the most frequently encountered kind of articles in journals. They primarily consist of data which is synthesized by the investigator. So data which is collected, curated, analyzed, and it is a discovery of some sort. And it can be of various kinds, starting from the lowest form of evidence, which is case series and case reports, to case control studies, where you have a disease group, mostly for us, people like us, and then a control group, which might be healthy or a disease control. Then there are cohort studies and randomized control trials, followed by systematic reviews. Sometimes you are trying to assess a diagnostic test, which comes under case control most of the times, although it could also vary depending on the structure of the study. So before we go into greater detail, you might like to familiarize yourself with the observational study designs. So case control versus cohort. Mainly it depends on when when an exposure is unknown and a disease is known, we study the diseased versus the individuals who are not diseased in a case control study. While if the exposure is known and the disease has occurred, this is the point when we are conducting research. So the disease has not yet occurred is when we call it a prospective study. While sometimes all the events have occurred and we want to know if the disease is there or not, and this is a retrospective cohort study. So primary research is basically new knowledge. So you start as we did so and this is what we found. And secondary research is primarily revisiting, reviewing, analyzing, and synthesizing existing research and just presenting it in a new light. So usually it doesn't add so much to literature, but it adds to your perspective because everything is out there in one place. And then there are editorials and opinion piece, which are smaller articles and focused on one particular topic and one particular area of interest. So apart from primary articles, the secondary ones also can be of various kinds, such as a narrative review, a case-based review, a systematic review. So meta-analysis is usually counted more as a primary kind of research, although there's some debate to it. And then tertiary articles can comprise of textbooks, handbooks, manuals, or encyclopedia. So this is data which is out there and has been around for a while, and you are just writing it up again in a simplified format for a more basic level researcher, basic level reader. And then gray literature is comprised by conference proceedings, posters, abstracts, government reports, university articles or documents, any kind of listings, online forums, blogs, and with the advent of social media, there's so much information out there, which all comes under the banner of gray literature. And then there's some special articles, which can be letters, editorials, pictorial essays, and few other interesting ones, which we will talk about in a bit. So coming to reviews, usually reviews, looks like my pen is on, yes. So reviews usually could be narrative reviews or systematic reviews. So narrative review is written by a seasoned researcher. It is usually solicited, and it is an authoritative and comprehensive overview of a particular subject, and it adds to the perspective of the reader. There's no definite structure to it. Usually it has an abstract, and then as it's the author's discretion. Citation impact is excellent because it has a lot of data consolidated out there and which can be cited by numerous other researchers. Systematic reviews could be conducted by anyone, and they are usually unsolicited. They have to be registered ideally on a platform known as Prospero. They have certain reporting standards like Prisma, and the search strategy is structured. It has to be verified by ideally 2 people or 3 or a bigger team, and it needs to be documented. So the intent is if anyone were to set out to do such a study, they should be able to read your methods and reproduce the same results. And then the structure, the IMRAD structure, which we will be familiar in a bit. That's what we'll be talking about today and the next session. And the analysis stage, sometimes the systematic review, particularly meta-analysis, will comprise of analysis where you will report it in this format, the population intervention, comparison, and outcome. Citation impact of these are good as this is a wealth of data all compiled together and usually gives a clear and new message than what is known. So just to give an example of this is a systematic review, the impact of ethnicity on clinical outcomes in COVID. And this is a review, a narrative review. So if nothing is written, it's usually a narrative review. And as expected, the narrative review would comprise of a search strategy. They would have clean records. They would have excluded certain articles for various reasons, which will be clearly cited, either the language or they're not related to the topic or the full text are not available. So the methods are clean. And then they have a data synthesis where they would describe, like here they're comparing the risk of COVID or the cases reported of COVID in different ethnicities compared with white patients. And you can see they have listed articles based on the type of literature they have scanned. And most of the preprints have identified an increased risk of infection, hospitalization, as well as mortality. So this data was out there in the public domain. But this clear message was not available before the systematic review was conducted. Apart from that, case reports are the lowest form of evidence, but sometimes you can also synthesize and systematically review data related to cases. For example, if you were to report a drug-induced complication, for example, here it is propylthiouracil-induced myositis. So here this patient had these symptoms, and then literature was searched on various databases, PubMed, Embase, and Scopus, to identify these articles. Some were excluded because of repetition or in languages other than English or not relevant to the search criteria. And eventually you will have fewer articles. So this is a simpler exercise than a systematic review, but it would identify the other cases which are reported of a rare entity. And your case will be out there for comparison, and you can clearly see how it stands with respect to literature. So this is a better compilation and reporting of data than a simple case report. So publication is all of you might wonder if it's a sprint. You might like to think so, but usually it is a marathon. And your perfect team may be placed in geographically disparate locations, and you may not always be in the situation to publish data from real patients, because quality primary research requires good cohort-based data or randomized control trials, which may take a lot of time. You may be in a new job, you may not have access to patients or wouldn't have enough patients as yet. You may not be able to collaborate in the immediate environment, or you may not have patients of your favorite disease. So still there are ways to drift afloat and with your favorite teams by doing research which is not limited to a particular site or location. So before we move further, you must be aware of the hygiene hypothesis, the very famous hygiene hypothesis, which talks about predisposition to asthma. And this was actually reported by this gentleman known as David Strachan, who was an epidemiologist at the London School of Epidemiology and Tropical Hygiene. And this was a hypothesis paper which was published way back in 1989. And it was not believed that time. He did a simple study. This was basically afterthoughts from a previous study, which he conducted in 17,000 British children who were born in households, and he found an indirect correlation between the risk of hay fever and the number of individuals in the family. So this was a very casual observation, which made him curious. And for a long time, it was not believed until you see 1992, when 3 citations poured in, and not until a decade later that more evidence started emerging with the advancement of immunology techniques. So better understanding of immunology and his hypothesis was now better understood. But yes, hypothesis articles are something. He did base it on his previous data, but you could also conduct hypothesis-based research by gathering or systematically searching data on a particular subject and formulating your own hypothesis. There are certain ethical issues to hypothesis articles, and not all journals accept those, but this can be avoided by a detailed listing of the pros and cons and the limitations of your hypothesis. It is more ethical, and this is the best kind of research because it takes research forward in the years to come. Apart from that, there can be methods paper. I'm sure you would be familiar with trial protocols. So oftentimes we see randomized control trials which are published, much awaited randomized control trials. Before they're out, the trial protocol would be published, and a systematic search strategy is another way. If you're conducting a systematic review, you could publish your search strategy prior to the actual systematic review. Sometimes guidelines are delivered, and these also are published. And the process then becomes a method paper. Apart from that, if you have detailed a case record form for collection of data by through collaborations, then that can be published so that other researchers can use that and avoid that effort. Apart from that, various laboratory techniques can be published as a methods paper, which is sometimes counted as an original article. So if you have a novel experimental method, a new technique of the laboratory, or even if you have deviated protocol and you have validated your findings that yes, you can reach the same results, this test is as valid, even with this deviated protocol, then that is important for researchers to know. And this comes under the category of a technical note. Similarly, if you biobank samples or followed a separate technique for something, then that comes under method paper. The advantages for this approach are many. Firstly, your methods are now subject to peer review. So this, you are still in the process of beginning the study. You haven't yet begun. And if the peers identify defects in your methods, then they will be identified at this stage itself. And you have still got a chance to improve your study. It also increases the transparency because there is a positive reporting bias in publication. So even if you get negative results now that you've published the trial protocol or the methods, it's likely that you will be transparent about all the results obtained. Also, it's available in public domain. So if it's a novel hypothesis or a novel study, then it stays there and it's documented. Moreover, other people may not embark on such initiatives because they know you're already doing it. Instead, researchers and patients may come forward and collaborate with you on this. Besides, you need to, it cuts down the words in your eventual paper. So you have to give reduced details. You end up, in fact, citing your own paper, which is an advantage in some ways. Besides, it prevents selective publication, again, something like related to transparency. And it may also be useful if you have a big cohort and you are planning to collect, identify different messages from that same data set, which is a registry, and you are going to publish many papers based on that, then it is preferable to first have the methods documented so you don't have to describe them in detail in every manuscript. So this is an example. We'll quickly go through a few. It is the systematic review of interventions to reduce loneliness in adults. And it was, so they published the search terms, the keywords which they used for search, and a data extraction form. Apart from that, they also published the research quality and bias assessment tools. The PRISMA flowchart is part of all of these papers. Similarly, if there is a workshop or a meeting in which something very important was discussed, this is again something which can be a conference summary. For example, the global conference for reactive arthritis, unfortunately, the last one was in 2000, where Zergen, Braun, and Sieber, two stalwarts in the field, identified the issues which were discussed, including the emerging spectrum of bacteria which lead to the disease, the immunology, the clinical profile, and also they define the criteria for reactive arthritis, which continue to be used even 2 decades later. Similarly, in India, we have previously documented if you have a collaborative network which is trying to set up, or if there's something important coming out of a meeting, it is best if it's documented and out there in the public domain for others to know and join you in that endeavor. Similarly, if you have designed case record forms and you want people to collaborate with you on it, you would not want them to go through the same exercise. And if it is available in the public domain, it is good as they can come forward and join hands in this exercise. Moreover, in this era of evidence-based medicine, it is very important to document the disease activity and use appropriate outcome measures. So if you're wanting a very detailed outcome measures, then it is best they detail all of them in a glossary of the research items, which is best done if you've published the case record form prior, as all this may not be possible in the eventual manuscript, where the word limit is obviously restrictive. Similarly, if you were to biobank or do some kind of laboratory research, and it is a modified protocol, like a cost-efficient model, which is relevant for a developing country, then this is again something you could take up, where you describe the step-by-step process, sample collection, transport, storage, and quality control, and the advantages, how it is cost-cutting in doing this kind of a thing, because this can then be used by other people. And this is again comes under the category of an original article. So this is something you are reporting even before you've begun the research, but you have not formulated the results. It's a method paper, and it would carry the detailed checklist, including the biospecimen processing, the clinical case details, collection and transport, everything step by step, so it can be reproduced by another person doing it. And if a large collaborative group of experts does it, then it can also come under the category of recommendations. Like the USTAR group has provided biobanking details for systemic sclerosis. Now, in this era of social distancing, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the survey-based studies, either have been an investigator or a participant. So this is something, in the interest of time, we will leave this discussion for another day. But yes, special articles it's all about a narrative eventually, and it is proposed that the narrative is the glue that holds literature and medicine together, and hence even comics have found their way into the special articles category. So a picture is anyways worth 1,000 words. So there are journals which take up cartoons, and usually the cartoons have a brief introduction and some clear messages for the readers. Like this one talks about taking care of the patient with the best systematic review, best data, but what is missing is the compassion, which obviously we all need to be reminded of. Apart from that, various journals like the Journal of American Medicine Association publishes poetry on a routine basis. And there are many others. So the poets amongst us now would know where to head to right after this lecture. And this brings us to the end of the session. We would probably take questions at a later time. And I would now invite Dr. Ravindran for the next talk on how to write the introduction section of a paper.
I'm audible and visible, Latika?
Yes, you are.
Right, you. Okay. So good evening, and thanks to Dr. Vikas and Anand and Latika for putting it all together. So I think we'll just kick on. So whatever type of manuscript you are writing, whatever type Latika has told you, it is important to remember some of the key principles of manuscript writing. And whatever it is, it cannot be done without writing a proper introduction. Before all that, I just wanted to say, when Dr. Vikas was talking about why we should be publishing, going further, why we should be actually focusing on how to write better is because we all are very good clinicians and researchers and do a very good job at sort of looking after our patients very well. But as a group, we are poor communicators and indeed poor writers. We are not taught this skill in the medical school. So as Anand has said, we learn this by doing. But again, some of the bits of manuscript writing is about knowing what it is actually entails, what should be there, and then trying to have a go at it. And whatever said and done, all the parts of a manuscript, typically this is how the manuscript is written. It will have 4 major components, that is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And you all know that each of this section asks some questions. Actually, it's the reader which is asking you these questions. Like when you are writing or when the reader is reading the introduction, he is asking, why did you start this study? What was the purpose of writing this piece? Whether it is a letter to the editor or a survey or even an editorial. Then when you're writing about results and the reader is going through it, he wants to know what actually was found in this particular study. So no part of the manuscript is not important. All the parts are equally important. The questions which are being answered are different. So the scope of each section is different. So that has to be remembered, because it is agreed that when it comes to research, it's the methods which is the most important part. You have done it. And then, of course, the logical representation or details of results is very important. But if I were to ask you, if you are just given a manuscript where you have methods and results without the head and tail, I mean, would you not struggle to identify what's going on? So I want you to come sort of move away from this notion that only this segment of manuscript is important. Coming back to the advantage of the format I had just mentioned with 4 major components is that they are in sequence, so they avoid repetition, because what you have put in the introduction, is not going to be there in the methods, and what you have done in the methods is not going to be there in the results. So there is a logical flow of information which a reader can easily understand. I don't know why this things are appearing on my screen. I'm not doing it, but anyway. So anyway, when you are writing a manuscript, there are reporting guidelines which we encourage all of you to go through for whatever type of research or clinical study or whatever you are, or even a review you are trying to write. And the checklist you will find will help you in not missing any of the important components of such reporting. Okay. So coming to the introduction, which is my major brief, as I said, the main components of writing an introduction is to actually answer 2 questions. That first is why at all you did this piece of research, meaning why at all did you even think of this question, what is called the research question. And what was the reason? What did you identify? Any gap in the published literature? Any lacunae? Any controversies, which led you to look into this particular question? So, in your short piece of introduction, these are the 2 things you have to focus. So, it is important to sort of have a logical flow of or logical structure in your introduction writing. You will start normally by a short review of the existing literature, and this has to be relevant. And then you can use something called a descriptive funnel. You start with something broad and narrow it down. So for example, you say that rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic autoimmune polyarthritis. And many drugs are used for the treatment of it, which are called disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. And you can sort of say methotrexate, whatever. However, in a proportion of patients, such medicines do not work. So for the last 20 years or so, another group of agents called biological agents are being used. Rituximab is an effective drug to be used in this type of scenarios. However, the effect or the toxicity profile of rituximab in Indian patients have not been studied so far. Of the limited literature which is available, few have pointed out to the increased incidence of, let's say, lymphopenia or some serious infections, while some of the other studies, which are mainly published as an abstract, inform us that that is not the case. So we identified, so this is a broad topic, and slowly we focus down to rituximab in rheumatoid arthritis, and we are specifically talking about the toxicity of rituximab in Indian patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And in this process, we identified 3 or 4 most relevant studies which have previously tried to address the various aspects which we just discussed in the introduction. We have not, like a thesis, we have not sort of done a very comprehensive review of literature here. We are right from the start very, very focused. And in doing so, in using our descriptive funnel, we have identified a gap in our knowledge. So the gap in knowledge in the example I have given was, we don't know what really happens in terms of the toxicity of rituximab in Indian patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So this will lead on to the question that what are the objectives of my study and how I am going to answer or find, or meet the objectives of the study. So as we say, we zoom in and zoom out. Okay. So the penultimate or the ultimate paragraph would be the hypothesis in your introduction. So you would say that, what is the experimental question? So like here in this example, we said, the toxicity of rituximab in Indian patients with rheumatoid arthritis, that will be answered by the present study. If I have a hypothesis, I need to mention it here. And then I need to mention that what approach I am going to say. So am I going to say that if I had planned an observational study, whether retrospectively or prospectively, for the defined length of time, then it has to be stated here. Whether it was a randomized controlled trial I have planned, so that has to come in the last paragraph of the introduction. When you are using a sort of a different type of test compared to the gold standard test, often you will find that the test is actually mentioned here. Just very briefly, because we are going to be discussing in detail about this when you are writing the method section. So if I ask you, what should be the ideal length of introduction? So in a 1,000-word manuscript, this cannot be more than 150 to 200 words, or 100 to 150 words. Because if you look at the example of one of the shortest, possibly shortest introduction in the history of medical academic publishing, is actually in front of you. I think there's in 24 or 5 odd words, Watson and Crick in their landmark paper actually set the tone. They just said that we wish to suggest a structure for the sort of DNA. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological interest. So the principles I have discussed actually can be found in totality here. And I think that is remarkable. So being economical with the words does not mean that actually you are losing the focus and you are not going to convey what you want to do, what you want to convey. Indian manuscripts are criticized for their verbosity. And I think that is the floral language, using too many words are really off-putting, especially when you're writing introduction. So in my checklist of writing the introduction, I would include these. I would check whether I have sufficiently reviewed the relevant literature, because my objective is to make the reader familiar with the subject. And I would check whether in doing so, reviewing the literature, did I identify any limitation, gaps in the knowledge, or any controversy which I plan to address. I will further check whether I have clearly stated the hypothesis or the primary or the secondary objectives of the study. And have I mentioned in brief that what actually is going to be in this study? I mean, whether it's going to be case control study, randomized control trial, or anything else. So when writing the introduction, it is important to remember that we a P is missing. So in the past tense, sorry about this, we had to say we did, we carried out, we hypothesized, because the study has been done. So if you look at the research manuscripts, they are all would be in past tense. Very few things, we will, let's say you will say that, we have planned or we are going to do, that will come in the very end of the discussion if you want to, if you really plan to do something like that. But it is important to always cite past related work by the authors, whether they are from India, whether the study is from India or abroad, it does not matter. Nowadays, see, the gone are the olden days where this type of retrieval of the previously published work was difficult. And then, only few had access to network and the computers and all that. It's not. By sitting here, we can go back 500 years ago and look at the published work. So it's important that the relevant work has to be cited, and always cite appropriately. The introduction is the first part of your manuscript, so whatever acronym you are going to use, you have to expand it here, because so don't count the abstract in here in doing so. So if I don't say that IMA-MS stands for Indian Medical Association Academy of Medical Sciences, a reader would not know what does this mean. And always use short, quick sentences. Avoid using and keep on extending the sentences. It is not necessary. And whatever shape your introduction has taken, you must revise it again thoroughly after you have completed the whole manuscript. And you have to verify whether the final results in the results section, as you have stated, primary, secondary analysis, and in the discussion, your discussion of those results actually tally with what you set out to do in the introduction. A couple of other things. It is important to remember that methods and results are actually a factual statement of things, what has been done and what has been found. In the introduction and discussion, you have some liberty, some literary freedom. I mean, in terms of, your, maybe let's say, command over the language and how you present things and all that. But remember, if you use small sentences and be focused, you don't need to be a major language expert at all. But when it comes to writing methods and results, they have to be. When the editors or reviewers gives you feedback, you will always see that if you left something out in the methods, the reviewer will ask, what is it? What is missing? Why not given? What? Or results. There will be a confusion in reviewer's mind when he will put questions about the results. But introduction and discussion, you will see that the remarks are usually actually too verbose, lacks focus, it's rambling. completely out of tune, it does not match with the objectives of the study. So this is, you have to distinctly address. It is not writing the methods and results section. So the feedback related to the introduction and discussion from the reviewers and the editors are totally different from what you get for methods and results. So this has to be kept in mind. And then I would say junk it, unnecessary details and history. Again, I will say that now, not that so much with the now, but you know, many from our countries really, I would say that, you know, like it would start with gout is an ancient disease, which was first described in this mummy which was found beside the river Nile 5,500 years ago. Completely unnecessary, not required. And long text, I have said enough about it. And then complex sentences, avoid using complex sentences. Keep it very, very simple. And very simply, your 3 to 4 paragraphs, again, even for sort of risking the repetition, I would say just identify what is the magnitude of the problem, what is the controversy, debate, lacunae, or gap in our knowledge, and what you are going to do about it, or what actually you did in your study. And whatever piece you are writing, of the numerous types so beautifully described by Latika, the common principle remains the same. When you write introduction, you are introducing the subject to the readers. You may be knowing a lot about the subject, but that is not the point. Your reviewers may not be often subject expert. It is very difficult now to get good reviewers. And they are also busy clinicians like you. They also spend a lot of time doing clinical medicine and research. So you have to help them in understanding what is actually this piece you have written is about. So George Orwell, I hope that everybody knows these are the principles of effective writing as proposed by him. And I would say there will be any debate, but I would further sort of identify 3 bits which I recommend everybody. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut out a word, always cut it out. Don't look at the word count. Don't look at, if your abstract can be 230 words, let it be. Why increase it to 250? So if you're given all the details, what is required in introduction, and it is coming to 150 to 200 words, so be it. And never use a foreign phrase, a jargon, the meaning of which you yourself are not sure. And particularly in English writing, I would advise everybody doing this. Manuscript writing is not a test of your English language skills. So this is very important. Writing clearly in a focused way is completely different from if you read good poetry, or let's say for speaking to English language, if you read good prose in English or good poetry, they are actually highly focused piece. They are not rambling. There is no jargon. That's why you like them. And that's why they have this enduring value. So I sort of, I would like everybody who's attending this webinar to keep George Orwell's principles of effective writing in mind. So I think I've finished. Thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Durga will brief us on how to write the results section, the method section of a manuscript. Over to Dr. Durga.
Good evening, everybody. I shall just start sharing my screen. Good evening and welcome to this webinar series. I shall be I do not have any disclosures. And basically, you start with the introduction, telling you describe what did you do, and this is followed later on by the results and discussion section when you present what you did find and what it all meant in context. So methods is the section which represents the planning and design of a study. Just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, if the methods are not strong, then your manuscript shall gradually lose balance and become tilted because the base is not strong. So it is the methods that requires careful planning right from the beginning before you even initiate the study, so that you can be sure that you're using appropriate methods to reach at the appropriate results. Many reviewers and editors would decide upon accepting or rejecting your manuscript by simply evaluating the method section irrespective of the results. And if you have flaws in the methods, they can seriously jeopardize the chances of getting your manuscript published. Many a time we feel that if the results are good, if they're positive results, then it may attract reviewers and editors. That's actually not the case. It's the methods, if they're sound, irrespective of the results. If you have a so-called negative study that has good methods and has arrived at a conclusion not being able to show a difference between two groups, despite the good methods, that's more likely to be accepted than something which shows a very so-called positive study, but with dubious methods. So these are the various concepts that should be addressed in the methods. You should be able to describe the PICOT, that is patient population, and you often have an intervention group and a comparator group, particularly in studies describing interventions. What are the outcomes and what is the time period during which you have looked at these outcomes, time period that you have conducted the study. Pre-planning the methods, the first step is important to identify the study question or hypothesis. And then after you have identified your hypothesis, you must plan the methods meticulously so that you can best answer whether your hypothesis is valid or not. So how do you generate a hypothesis? You do thorough literature searches through specialist databases to identify observations or gaps in knowledge based on prior work of investigators, possibly could be your own work, with due attention to ethical aspects, identify gaps in knowledge, and identify questions whose answers are not yet known, that is, whose answers are equivocal, and then generate a hypothesis. This is the most important step while planning a research study. Thereafter, you must plan an appropriate study design, a study of adequate power, and a study with adequate sample size so that you can adequately answer your question based on the findings of your study. It's best to have a written plan for a study before initiating it. And this would generally be the case while writing a study protocol for approval or for funding by different funding agencies. But it's best nevertheless to always write a study plan, even if you're not submitting it somewhere for approval. It's always best to think of different ways to test your hypothesis rather than just a single way. For example, you may have an hypothesis that cardiovascular risk is increased in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. You could test this hypothesis by different ways. You could look at clinical events on a follow-up study. You could look at subclinical atherosclerosis by carotid intima media thickness or other techniques. You could look at cardiovascular risk scores. You could look at laboratory markers which reflect cardiovascular risk. And it's best to have more than one way of looking at it, and also ensure a comparison with a control group, because unless you have a comparison with a control group, you cannot say whether there is increased cardiovascular risk in patients with rheumatoid arthritis or not, because you would just get a set of values. But unless you can compare it with somebody, you really cannot tell whether it's increased or decreased or it's similar. So the methodology section should answer the following questions: whether the study was approved by the ethics committee or appropriate regulatory authorities like clinical trial registration, whether patient consent was obtained, what were the sources of funding, how was sample size calculated, It may not be as important if it's a pilot study, but generally sample size is one of the most important considerations during planning your study. And it is important so that your study is adequately powered to answer the question that you have posed. Where the study was done, who were the study subjects, how they were recruited, what is being studied. It is important to clearly state primary and secondary objectives. And in general, a study shouldn't have too many objectives to answer. And your sample size calculation is generally based on the primary and at the best some key secondary objectives, rather than your study being powered to answer 20 different questions. You need to identify that these are the primary questions that my study wants to answer and what is an adequate sample size for that. You should describe how the data was collected, when it was done, the study period, what was the study design? Was it an observational study? Was it an interventional study? Was it a cross-sectional study, case control study, or whatever? How the study was done, using what procedures? Let's say, for example, you are measuring levels of interleukin-6. This is a cytokine that is being widely touted in COVID-19. But unless you say that you measured interleukin-6 by which technique, commonly used technique is ELISA, but you might have used some other technique also. You cannot compare results from different studies unless you know what procedures they have used to make specific measurements. And finally, you must describe how the data was analyzed, what statistical methods were used for analysis of the data, so that somebody can understand what analysis strategy you have used and can try to replicate it. The idea for a methodology section is that somebody, after reading your methodology, should be able to replicate your study in toto, so as they can verify these findings in another population. That is the overall idea of writing a good method section. Ethics committee and research ethics committee overview is very important, and often it's something which is not very well understood by us. As per the Indian Council of Medical Research 2017 guidelines, all human studies or animal studies will require an ethics committee overview before they can start. And there are 3 types of review that can occur. There could be an exemption from review for studies which involve, say, minimal contact with participants, like questionnaire-based surveys, particularly of educational practices. There could be an expedited review for studies which involve minimum risk, say studies which are looking at just files, case records of patients without any direct contact with patients, or a full committee review for studies which involve contact with patients, which may involve some interventions if they're clinical trials and so on. So more or less, there are 2 issues that you need to address in original research articles. And these are 2 distinct issues. One is informed consent and the other is ethics committee overview. We often mix the 2 issues together. These are 2 different things. First is informed consent, whether you have informed the participants of your study that you are going to include them in this study and you're going to use this data for what purpose, and you have sought their permission or not. Informed consent is not general consent. Sometimes patients, when they are admitted to the hospital, they would give consent for admission, for treatment, for the use of the data. That is not informed consent. Informed consent is you have planned a study, you have asked a subject whether they can participate, they have agreed to participate, and they have given in writing that they have agreed to participate. That is called as informed consent. So if you have not sought informed consent, if you have only sought a general consent, then you should not write that informed consent has been obtained. For example, a retrospective chart review. You may not be able to contact the patients in question because that data was collected a long time back. In that case, you can always apply to the ethics committee to apply for a waiver of informed consent. You do not need informed consent provided the ethics committee certifies that you do not need it. In that case, even if the patient has given general consent, it is not suitable to write that informed consent was obtained because it was general consent, not informed consent. The second, as I mentioned, was research ethics committee overview. The research ethics committee review and approval is required for most types of studies, particularly in India. research ethics committee may provide a waiver of written informed consent and rarely provide exemption from reviews for low-risk studies like surveys of educational practices. For participants from other parts of the world, local regulations regarding informed consent and research ethics committees may vary, and it is essential that they should be cited if deviations exist from the norms. If there is no requirement for a particular ethical review for a particular type of study in your country, you should cite those regulations. For clinical trials, pre-registration is mandatory and all trial results should be attempted to be published even if negative. For case reports, here also it's important to mention about written consent to publish. And there are other ethical concerns for other types of articles. We shall not look at them in this. In the manuscript, you must mention the full name of the approving ethics committee, the document submission number to the said ethics committee, and the date of approval. And in multi-centric studies, all centers must have ethics approval at their individual sites. And if these are multinational, then the ethical standards may vary depending on local regulations. Let's say a questionnaire-based survey that is filled by the patient. In India, you may require informed consent from the patient, but in other countries, you may just require verbal consent from the patient. So you must mention the ethical aspects that are relevant in different centers as per their local requirements in your manuscript. And you must mention clearly about written informed consent and waiver of informed consent, as well as for case reports, you must have written consent to publish from the patient and guardian. Methods in a protocol is written in a future tense. Methods in a manuscript is written in the past tense. And basic statistical questions that must be answered are the size of the sample, the duration of follow-up, and the completeness of follow-up. The ICMJ guidelines are something that all of you must go through. These are freely available at the ICMJ website. And these mention that you should describe how the selection of participants was done, the study design, that you should aim to include representative populations, ensure correct use of the terms sex and gender. If the study was done using an exclusive population, you must justify why. And if you're determining race or ethnicity, you should mention why it was determined and how it was determined. You must specify primary and secondary objectives, identify methods, equipments, and procedures, including manufacturer name of, say, kits or machines that you have used in your study. Give references to established methods, including statistical methods. Provide references and brief descriptions for methods that have been used but are not well known, and describe new or substantially modified methods. Identify precisely all drugs and chemicals used, and identify appropriate scientific names and gene names. Statistics. Describe statistical methods with enough detail to allow somebody to judge whether it's appropriate and to verify the reported results. When possible, quantify findings and present them with appropriate measurement error and uncertainty, such as confidence intervals. Avoid relying solely on statistical hypothesis testing, such as p-value. It is important to understand that one must try to convey the effect size and precision estimates rather than just presenting the p-values, because p-values by themselves mean nothing other than the fact that how likely you are to reject a null hypothesis when it is actually true. Whereas the effect size will tell you how much is the difference between the two groups, and that is much more important. References for the design of study and statistical methods, define statistical terms, abbreviations, and most symbols. Specify which statistical software you used, because results may vary slightly from software to software. And always distinguish pre-specified from exploratory analysis, including subgroup analysis. You must pre-specify some analysis, and some other additional analysis may be done later on, but they should be clearly delineated. Normality assessment is essential, and parametric measures, that is means with standard deviations, should be used only if the sample size is adequate and data is normally distributed. Otherwise, non-parametric measures like medians with range or interquartile range should be used. What are common mistakes that scientists often make or authors often make? The study may not be designed to answer the question posed. For example, if the question is, do patients with rheumatoid arthritis have greater prevalence of metabolic syndrome? If you do not have a group of healthy controls, you cannot have a comparator. Including the results in the methods, or not describing something in the methods, but the results describe it. This is again something that irritates reviewers. For example, you may have stated in a study of cardiovascular risk in rheumatoid arthritis that you're going to look at serum cytokine levels in the methods. But you may not have mentioned it in the methods, but you mention it in the results, then that looks disparate and you should try to avoid that. So after writing your results, just go back to the methods and check whether everything that you have described has been described in the methods in the first place or not. Using inappropriate statistical tests, using parametric tests for small numbers. And if you have two groups for comparison, if you have less than 5 events in a group, then you should use the Fisher's exact instead of a chi-square. And when you're presenting scores, for example, the health assessment questionnaire, scores are discrete numerical values. They're not exactly continuous. Continuous means that between any two values, you should have a possibility to have an infinite number of values. For example, if it's a visual analog scale with 10 steps, 0 to 10, then between 1 and 2, obviously, you cannot have any values. So that's not continuous. They're ordinal, but discrete values. They are not continuous values. So ideally, they should be presented using medians with interquartile range. Identifying sources of bias in a study, be it selection, performance bias, exclusion bias, or detection bias. These also should be clearly delineated. So the peer reviewer essentially looks for the method section being concordant with the results and clear description of methods and inclusion of appropriate controls and clearly defined outcomes which are objectively validated. For qualitative studies, which is a different type of studies, established qualitative research methodology must be used. If you are using a technique from a published study, you should cite the same and provide a summary in the text. Materials and instruments should be identified and should not include in the methods information that belongs in other sections like introductions or results. So to conclude, the method section is the core of your manuscript in that it helps somebody to judge whether you have used an appropriate methodology to arrive at your conclusions. And that's the most important thing in the scientific process. It should be clear and concise. It should be able to replicate the study and judge the validity. It should be in about 3 to 5 paragraphs. The first paragraph describing ethics approval and participant selection, as well as funding sources. The second to fourth paragraph on variables and procedures for primary and secondary objectives. And the last paragraph on analytical methods that are used, the statistical methods used to analyze your results. So I would like to conclude and thank you. And I don't know if any questions can be asked. If any want to be asked, they're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Durga. We'll try to take questions at the end. We'll now move over to Dr. Goyal, who will be speaking about results.
Hi, good evening, friends. And I'm so glad to see that so many of you have stayed till the end of the seminar today. And I'm glad that by this time you would have realized that there are different sections to a manuscript. And if I summarize everything in one sentence, I could say that if you are writing the introduction, you just need to tell the audience why you think your topic or why you think your study is important. When you're writing the methods, you need to tell them how you exactly did it. When you're writing the observations and results, you need to tell them what they found. And when you are finally doing your discussion, you tell them how your results compare to the other studies. And when you write your conclusions, you tell them how you are interpreting and extrapolating your findings to other people who are not included in the study. So I would be restricting in the next 15 minutes the writing of the results section of your manuscript. And without talking much about everything else, I would let you know that by the end of this presentation, you would know the sequence of writing results. you would be able to enumerate the components and the structure of a good results section. You would be able to choose wisely between tables and figures, and you would know how to make the table one of your manuscript. So let's first talk about what is the sequence to be followed while you're writing the results. So we often get asked this question: is it chronology that is most important? Do you write your results based on chronology? What happened first? What happened second? What happened later? Or do you base your results on logic? Which is the most logical conclusion? I take it up first. What's the next logical conclusion? I take it up second. Or do I base my results on the importance? Shall I go and take the bull by the horns and take the most important and most significant results first, and then talk about the rest of the results? So there is no clear answer on this. You could use any one of them depending upon what is your research question, what are your results, who are your audience, and how you would like to handle them. Results, when you're writing them, you describe the patient population at baseline. That's how you begin. And usually that's how most papers will start. If you're doing a longitudinal study in terms of a cohort or a randomized control trial, you want to see how the population compared at baseline in terms of your variable, the dependent variable that you are trying to study. You develop flowcharts in trying to depict the changing patient disposition at different time points in your study. We will take it up later in one of the few following slides. Then you also describe the changes after your intervention. What was the primary outcome? What was the secondary outcome? And if you found any unexpected findings that were not listed initially in your plan, then you discuss those in your results. So that itself is one of the way to present your results. You do the primary outcome first, you do the secondary outcome second, and you do the unexpected findings next. It's always good in results that you give your actual numbers and percentages. One question that again we are often asked is, do you write references in your results section? Well, obviously, if you're writing your own results, you do not write any references. And we'll take it up more in a later slide. So what are the components of a good results section? Like I said in the previous slide again, to define the patient characteristics or the population characteristics at the baseline. If you're doing a case control, if you're doing a cohort, if you are doing a randomized control trial, you have a dependent variable of interest. You define the population characteristics at baseline in the two groups divided by this character or the variable which is of interest to you, and you describe the total population at the beginning itself to discuss that what were the population characteristics at baseline. Then you discuss what happened after your intervention or your observation, which was obviously the primary objectives that you started off to do the research on. And then you discuss the secondary objectives. What was the subgroup analysis? Were there any adverse drug reactions? That's how you tackle them. Now, we discussed earlier about a workflow diagram. Let's see what a workflow diagram says. It's always good in any kind of study, whether it's a randomized control trial or a cohort study or any longitudinal study for that matter, or a case control study, to demonstrate or show this in a figure or a picture which you have prepared, and you put this along with your manuscript. In the first, you put the how many people did you assess for eligibility? Then you try and see during the enrollment how many were found unsuitable and how many did you finally randomize. So I've taken this as a randomized control trial as a prototype for trying to depict this workflow diagram. But don't believe that this kind of a diagram is only made for a randomized control trial, and you should be using it for every study that you are publishing or trying to publish. Following the enrollment, then you show the allocation, how many were there in each group, in the intervention group and in the placebo group, if you have a placebo controlled trial. And then you show how many were lost during follow-up. If they were lost during follow-up, why they were lost during follow-up, And finally, you talk about how many were you finally analyzing in each group. That kind of a workflow diagram gives more credibility to your study, and the reader can see and look at this workflow diagram and understand in one single glance how the study proceeded and what went on. Now, another question that readers often struggle with, or the writers often struggle with, is whether to use tables or figures, when to use tables, when to use figures. So let's demystify this for you. When you have detailed numerical presentations, you use tables. If you want to show actual and precise numbers and percentages, you use tables. When you want to compare two different groups, you use tables. So when do you use figures? When you have clinical images, you want to show patient pictures or procedure pictures, or a surgical procedure that has been done, or an injection technique that has been achieved. You want to show those kind of figures, you do clinical images. But as Dr. Durga said in a previous talk, you need to take consent from the patients if you are trying to show their clinical images, and you need to be careful that you have anonymized them and they are not identifiable. You have removed all identity markers from these figures. When you want to display large numbers of data points, then it's the time to use figures, because tables would become too confusing then. Please remember that figures take more space. So if you have a simple data, such as a pie chart, that's not a good thing to show in a figure in a manuscript when you are sending it, because space is premium. Although we are shifting to online and open access journals now, yet most editors would be more akin to those mindset of printed journals, and many journals do come out in print as well as online versions. So please avoid simple figures which can briefly be described in one line or more, so that they don't take too much space. If you want to indicate changes over time, like this particular graph here shows several data points, and you have these data points which are depicted over time, then you would certainly want to use a graph or a figure instead of a table. So again, for any table or a figure, there has to be a clear declarative title at the top. Most of the content of the table or the figure should be evident from this particular title. Every table and figure should also have a legend. A legend would describe the abbreviations if they are used in the table, would talk about significance levels. If the p-values are significant, you mark them by a star, and then you describe in your legend that the star indicates a significant p-value or a significant difference. Now, p-values are not the gold standards or the final answers, but then yes, we are all obsessed with p-values, so I'm using that term here anyway. If there is any other explanation needed for this figure or a table that you have drawn, then you do need to give it in the part of the legend. So when to make a table, as I said in one of the previous slides, if you have a lot of numbers, then you make a table. But if you find that your table is too small, then it's better to convert it into a text. A table should be a standalone unit. It should be a single unit, and everything that you want to convey from a table should become evident from the table itself, without requiring the reader to go into the text and read what is written in the text to be able to understand the table. That means he should be able to understand the table just by reading the table and not by reading the text. If you have a lot of columns and lines, please prune them, prune the number of the columns and lines. If your table exceeds one page, it is always better to redraw your table and take out additional information that is not required. Avoid too narrow and avoid too broad tables if you find them. A little more about table 1. So like I said earlier, the table 1 is a standardized format across literature. In the table 1, usually, this is not a thumb rule, there are differences, but usually you would find 4 columns. The first column lists the independent variables. The second column and the third column would be the cases and the controls, or the two groups divided by the dependent variable which is under investigation and which is your variable of interest. The fourth column would give the values of these variables, the means, the percentages, the frequencies, the standard deviations in the total population. So column 1, the variables; column 2, the cohort or the cases and controls in 2 and 3, and the column 4 would give the total population. And those which are found significantly different at baseline would be marked by a star or another way to highlight that these are different significantly at the beginning of the study. Tables 2 and 3 are usually optional and do not form a very uniform pattern, and they depend upon what is the subject of your study, what is the primary objective, what is the secondary objective, and how your results are panning out. If you have numbers in the tables, please do not repeat them in text. Any information that is presented in the table does not need to be repeated in the text of the manuscript. You can state numbers from figures if you want exact precision in your tables. And it is always good to put a line of reference in your manuscript where you want the reader to look at figure X or table Y while reading the manuscript, but you do not repeat the information that has been presented in the tables or in the figures back into your manuscript. So this is just an example of table 1. Now this does not have the promised 4 columns as I told you in a previous slide, but yes, this gives the variables here. It lists the different variables and it will, in this first column, it has got all the variables and it has got all the values in the right-hand column. If it's a mean, it gives the standard deviation usually. Here, it is probably giving the interquartile range as a median. And depending upon the kind of variable you have either numbers or percentages, or you have means and standard deviation. And this description comes in the legend, which is put up below the table. So when you have figures, it is always better to make your figures before you start writing. Once you have made your figures, you redraw your figures and remove any clutter that is there. You should use the least non-data ink in your figures. And each figure should have captions, legends, and abbreviations which are described clearly. If you have case studies, then you should have the images of X-rays or figures or ECGs, whatever you want. But please do remember that you need to remove any identifying characteristics that may be there on your figures, and you should have permission or consent from the patients and the participants whose figures and images you are using in your study. Your captions should be clear, precise, and self-sufficient. That goes without saying. Now, if you're choosing which graph to present or which figure you need to draw, then there are certain rules or certain guides which you can use here. A line graph is a graph which is plotted data pairs, connected line segments, and that examines a change in quality or quantity over time. So in a previous slide, we just saw how a line graph looks. So if I take you back to that previous slide, so this is exactly how a line graph would look like. You have two lines which are connecting different time points and different values of the systolic blood pressure in different areas in an individual. That's a clear or a very simple line graph that is there. If you have a bar graph, which is the next kind of a graph, so you may have a bar graph which looks like this, which is a single bar, or you could have a stacked bar graph in which you have different bars in the same image. You could have a histogram, which is more or less a frequency distribution and talks about the frequencies and gives the frequency distribution of the variable. And another good figure to put into your manuscripts is the scatter plot. A scatter plot gives the distribution of two continuous variables on two axes, and it gives a good relation. So anybody looking at this particular figure can see that there is a kind of a linear association between these two variables which are being studied, and there is a roughly linear increase in one variable as the other variable increases. While writing the results section, I'm coming to the close of this talk. You do avoid using words like clearly, essentially, quite, basic, rather, fairly, really, virtually. Yes, these do appeal to the reader's emotions, but they do lower your objectivity and scientific credibility. So in the last slide here, I have presented a rubric which is generally used by reviewers when they are trying to guide a manuscript or when they are trying to review a manuscript. So if you have this kind of a rubric and you can follow how you can get the maximum points in the fourth column. And I will leave this rubric on the screen so that you can maybe take images or use it. I'm happy to share the slide sets also with you, and Dr. Latika and could easily share these slides with the participants. I have no problem and conflicts of interest in sharing my slides. With that, I would rather come to an end of this session, and to sum it all up, please remember that your results are not your interpretations. They are raw results. You do not use references in your results section because you're describing your own work and not anyone else's work. And if at any point of time you find yourself tempted to include a reference, it means that you are ready to write the discussion which is coming in session next. If you have any questions, I think we are at the end of the session, and I'll be happy and here to answer those questions once Dr. Latika permits that session is over and we can accept questions.
Yes, we're ready to take questions. Maybe we can ask all speakers to join in. I think Dhruv, Dr. Dhruv had a question. He wants to know what is non-data ink, which you talked about.
Colors. So some people have got a tendency to color their figures and beautify them. So that's not required in scientific publication. You really don't need to do that.
Good evening, this is Dr. Abhishek. I have one question that at times I come to a situation where 90% of my data has been enclosed into a table.
What has been brought into a table?
90% of the data which I have to write, that results,
Yeah.
I mean, results, they are already included in the table.
आपके पीछे आवाज बहुत है. There is a lot of noise behind you. Can't really understand what you're trying to say.
Take some time. Meanwhile, somebody else.
Fair enough. What I understand is probably you are saying that if you find that 90% of your results are already included in one of your tables, what should you do? You don't have any material to write in the text. Well, if you can do that, and if you have 90% of your data into your text,
Yeah, hello.
awesome. I don't think there can be anything better than that.
Hello. Yeah, okay.
Do we have any other questions?
And is there any unsaid or said rule that like how much that discussion should contribute to an article? One reviewer said that it should not be more than 25% of the rest of the methods, introduction and results.
So a rough rule of thumb to tell you, most of the original articles would be about 3,000 words. A good introduction can definitely be completed in 500 to 600 to 700 words. A good method section again can be done within 500 to 600 words. A discussion usually is about 800 to 1,000 words, and the results could results are written in another 500, 600 words, and your conclusion in about 100 to 200 words. Dr. Ravindran might want to take it up because he's editing so many, but that's just a rule of thumb that I would like to share.
Thank you, Dr. Goyal. Dr. Ravindran, would you like to add to it? I can unmute you. Right.
I think what Dr. Goyal said is correct. I mean, I think, what I would like to highlight is that whatever you want to say, if you have said it, don't look at the number of the words, some very good piece of research do not extend beyond 1,500 words in total. So for a review and all that, you will have a brief that, it has to be 2,500 or 3,000 words. For the original articles, the word limits are actually unset. Okay, you may have a lower limit of the word count, because then, of course, the journals like ours want to categorize them in brief report as opposed to the original articles. In terms of the value, the recognition, everything is same, but it is just the lower number of word counts. We put them as a brief report, and of course, if it's a pilot study and if it is a preliminary results and things like that. For the introduction and the discussion, what Dr. Goel said is correct. See if your total, let's say brief is 3,000 words, then easily sort of, 500 odd words for the introduction, and double of that, about 1,000 words for the discussion. But in the introduction and in the discussion, you want to convey something very, very specific. And also in the results and methods, you want to make a very clear and often detailed statement of what was done and what has been found. So if you can achieve that in 1,000 words, 1,500 words, fair enough. If you need more than that, then of course, within the brief given by the journal in terms of instructions to the authors, and then it should be fine. Okay.
I had this question for Dr. Durga. Now, he did mention about approval, means consent. Now, if we have patients whom we have followed up, and this is a retrospective case series, and we have lost the patient to a follow-up, can we get an ethics committee clearance for informed consent not being taken?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, indeed, if it's a retrospective review of records, wherein you are not going to get directly in contact with the patient, the Indian regulations are very clear. They allow the ethics committee to give you a waiver of consent. But still, you would have to approach the ethics committee to get this permission for waiver of consent. Because most journals would ask you regarding these two distinct issues. One is the research ethics committee overview, and second is consent. So to counter this portion, when you're writing your manuscript, when you're submitting a manuscript, you need to get both these clearances. So you ask your ethics committee for a waiver of written informed consent, and most ethics committees would give you in these circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Durga. So Dr. Ronak has a question here. He asks us, why do we write scientific papers? For the modern world, a scientific communication is your Twitter post, your blog, your WhatsApp message, all rolled into one. So was that a question, Dr. Ronak? Can you please clarify, or was that a statement? Because you're saying because there are journals? I will unmute you. Can someone unmute him, please? Not able to identify. Yes. Yes, Dr. Ronak. So if that was a question, definitely social media is the new frontier for dissemination of information, and there's a lot on that, and we probably have a lecture at the end of the webinar series scheduled for this. But the emerging issue is misinformation on social media channels, and this is something we'll talk about in great detail. Maybe you need to wait for our next series of lectures to that. Thank you.
Latika, I just wanted to comment on what Ronak has said. I think this is a very good question, actually. Many of us are asking, for lay public. I mean, this is what is it about? And the activities we see on the Twitter and the Facebook, and also my personal reservations about the preprint service. I mean, people have to be convinced that what is the additional value of publishing in journals, really. So I don't think, these are easy questions to be answered. But definitely, look forward to one of the editorials in my journal on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravindran. Anyone else has any comments to add to this? So there is another question from Dr. Lamis. Few narrative review articles aim to just gather information or evidence together rather than having a clear question or hypothesis. And is this justifiable, and how do reviewers assess that? So this, I feel, depends on whether the review is solicited or not. So a lot of journals sometimes solicit reviews from experts in the area, and a lot would depend on the quality and the type of journal and the kind of articles they like to publish. But if it is unsolicited, then definitely this is something of concern. And even in general, there should be a sense of direction in the review article and a clear message arising out of it. And the reviewer is of their free will. If they do, their intent is ideally is to enhance a manuscript. So I would say if the reviewers do not like it, they should always feel free to offer their comments.
Yep. So two things in that, Lamis. I don't know if that's your name or it's just a depiction of your name, Lamis. Gone are the days when the reviews used to be non-systematic. So most of the time we are doing only systematic reviews, and you can do a systematic reviews only if you have a hypothesis and a research question to be answered. And most of the systematic reviews are at the top of the evidence pyramid nowadays. And because there is so much literature around that, unless you do a systematic search of that literature and present your answers, nothing else is justifiable. An unsystematic review without a hypothesis, without any clear research question, is as good as the waste in your waste paper basket. So just trash it.
The other question is, why do case reports have low weightage? So case reports.
So there is nothing like low weightage or high weightage. Case reports have their own significance in the pyramid of evidence. And although it's like we tell that this is high and this is low and this is best and this is not best, but case reports and other research styles and research methodologies have individual values and individual value depending upon the research question that you are trying to answer. A case report for something, let me give you an example. When COVID started, the first time we ever got the details of the patient on WhatsApp or on other media, we realized how valuable that information was for us. And first time when we read anosmia as a feature, that didn't come as a randomized control trial, that didn't come as a longitudinal study, that didn't come as a meta-analysis, that didn't come as a systematic review. It came as a case report, practically as a case report. So it's wrong to say that they have a low value or a high value. They have their own place and their own significance. Dr. Ravindran, I'm sure you want to add something on that.
Thank you, Dr. Goel. Yes, very, very relevant. I think case reports are extremely important. And for this, I mean, both the Indian Journal of Rheumatology and the Edinburgh Journal have case report sections. So, images, cases of the quarter, case-based reviews, or individual case reports, even as letter to the editors, we have been publishing. And they, as Dr. Goyal said, within the sort of the pyramid of structure of the knowledge, or the knowledge structure, it has got its own value. If you look at the olden literature of medicine, they all have been written by keen observers. They did not know this will lead on to a discovery of new disease in 300 years' time. So basically, if you read the old literature, they are all case reports. But the observations, if had they not been shared in this sort of scientific domain, we would not have probably discovered, or might have discovered them much later. For the Royal College Journal, for these reasons, we have what is called College Journal Prize, where so it is for the trainees. The first author should be a trainee. So we have the original articles, but we have a prize for the case reports also. And I would have this sent across to everybody, a beautiful advocacy on the case reports by Stefan Slatter in the March issue of the journal, which says, if case reports be the food of knowledge, write on our cases of the quarter. Beautiful. Thank you.
Dr. Durga would like to add something to this.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to add a point about the question regarding narrative reviews. Actually, what happens as of today is one often gets a lot of systematic reviews which are generated by commercial companies from certain regions of the world, not India, fortunately. And very often they would just be redundant. A narrative review that is written by an expert in the field with a critical overview and with a focused objective is sometimes much more valuable than those systematic reviews, which may be redundant and may not really provide a critical overview, may just provide a synthesization of the literature without critically looking at what it really means. So again, for a narrative review also, for young authors, I would suggest you always have a systematic search strategy to guide your narrative review, to answer specific questions, and try to focus your review on that. That would be most valued by reviewers and editors in many journals.
All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. And we have a few more questions pouring in, but maybe we will begin the next session by taking them. I'll make a mental note of these questions and hope to see you again on next Tuesday. Thank you and good night.